We're going to talk about the Hardy-Weinberg principle, which states that if 5 conditions are met, the allele frequency of a population for a trait will not change over time. Now we'll talk about those 5 conditions in a second, but basically what it means is this. Over time, populations will stay the same if those 5 conditions are met. So let's just take one example. Let's take a look at something like tongue rolling. So the ability to roll your tongue is a dominant trait. It's caused by a dominant allele, so we'll call it big T. And of course, like I said, that is dominant to the allele for not rolling your tongue, which we'll call little t. So if we could actually take a look at the population of Canada and count up the number of people that were homozygous dominant and heterozygous and homozygous recessive, and if we could actually count the number of alleles of each type in the population, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, we found that 60% of those alleles were big T, were the dominant form, and therefore 40% would be little t, the recessive form. Now what the Hardy-Weinberg principle says is if 5 conditions, which we're going to talk about in a second, are met, then this will always be the same. This will not change. It'll still be 60-40 in 10 years, and 15 years, and 20 years. And again, that's if those 5 conditions are met. So, that begs the question, what are those 5 conditions? And here they are. The population has to be big. There can be no mutations occurring. Mating has to be random. There can be no one moving in or moving out of the population. And there can be no natural or artificial selection taking place. Now, if you take a look for a second at these 5 conditions, it's not hard to see that most populations wouldn't meet all 5 of those conditions. So why is this theory important? Well, this theory is important because it tells us why populations are changing. So if those 5 conditions remain constant, populations don't change. But if one of those 5 conditions is not held, then that causes a population to change. So that's why this theory is important, because it tells us what causes a population to change. And the 5 things that can cause a population to change are small population, non-random mating, mutations, selection, or migration is occurring. So we're going to take a look first at population size and see how a small population can cause the genetics of a population to change. Now we're going to take a look at just one trait, and we'll just make it simple and make it eye color. And for our purposes, we know that eye color is, well, we'll just say it's easy, 2 alleles, B and little b, and big B is brown, and we know that brown is dominant to blue. Okay, so let's say I've got a population here, 6 individuals, and I think you'd agree with me, 6 individuals is a pretty small population. And if we count up the number of big B's in the population, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the number of little b's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we'll see that they're equal. So 50% big B in this population, 50% little b in this population. Now, as in any population, not everyone reproduces, not everyone mates. So we've just picked 3 of those individuals at random. There we have it. You can see, just by fluke, the allele frequencies changed. It went from 50% big B to 33% big B. And again, the reason is just because it's a small population, and just by chance, not everyone gets to mate, just by chance, that population changed. This is called genetic drift. And this genetic drift, this is a fairly important concept. And really, it is just in a small population, allele frequencies can change over time due to chance. That's what genetic drift is. One type of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect occurs when you have a small population, and due to some natural disaster or disease or something like that, most of the population is wiped out. And the surviving population, the genetics of that surviving population is not the same as the genetics of the original population. So, as an example, we can take a look at this bottle filled with little beads. And each of these beads represents an individual in the population. And you can see it's probably about half white and half blue with a few yellows sprinkled in there. Now then, when there's a natural disaster, what we do is we flip the bottle upside down, we pour out a few individuals, and that constitutes the survivors. So if we take a look at the surviving population, just by chance, we see that the population has changed. It used to be about equal blue and white with a few yellows. Well, now there's no more yellows, and it's almost exclusively blue. Now this can only happen in a small population. In a large population, first of all, it's not likely you're going to wipe out most of the population, and you're going to have a significant number of survivors if there is. So the small population thing just doesn't hold. So here's another example. So there's a population, and we see the genotypes of these individuals, and if you were to count up the number of big B's and little b's in this population, you would see it's about 50-50. But unfortunately, we have a flood, and those individuals don't survive. And if we just take a look at the survivors, we see that it's 30% big B now, as opposed to the original 50%. So just by chance, a great proportion of the population is wiped out. The populations of the survivors don't match the original population. So that's the bottleneck effect. Now this is called the founder effect. So it's a little bit different because we don't have individuals in a population being wiped out. What we have is a group of individuals from one population moving away and founding their own population, hence the name founder effect. So let's say we have a population here, as we can see, and those are the genotypes of the survivors, and we can see if you counted it up, you'd see there's 50% big B. Now these individuals, for some reason, perhaps they just got bored of the others and they wanted to move away and start their own population, or maybe they were physically separated from their other population, and they, by necessity had to start their own population. Whatever the reason, when these guys move away and start their own population, you can see that instead of 50-50, in this population, big B has a frequency of 75%. So that's the founder effect. Okay, now let's talk about gene flow. Now gene flow illustrates what can happen when I have members of two different populations mixing. So sticking with eye color, so we've got two populations here. So we've got population 1, and maybe this can represent some country like maybe Angola. And I've never been to Angola, but I would imagine that most people in Angola have brown eyes. And population 2 can maybe represent Sweden. And a lot of people in Sweden have blue eyes. So just to keep it simple, we'll say this population is exclusively blue-eyed, and this population is exclusively brown-eyed. And as long as these populations are kept separate, that will never change. However, once we start allowing these populations to mix, so a couple of individuals move away and enter the new population, well, we can see that new trait has been introduced in that population. It's no longer all blue eyes. Now we're going to have a couple of brown-eyed individuals in that trait. And this, in that population, pardon me. And this happens anytime we have individuals moving between populations. They bring new alleles, new traits with them. Okay, let's take a look at random mating and how that can affect a population. The fact is that in nature, very few populations exhibit random mating. Random mating would imply that any individual in a population is equally likely to mate with any other individual. And we know that just doesn't happen. We know that most animals, especially females, tend to choose their mates based on their traits. So a female of some kind of animal is more likely to mate with a big, strong male than a weak male. And the reason is she instinctively knows that her offspring with that big, strong male are more likely to survive than any offspring she would have with that weakling male. So for instance, if you were a female peacock and you had a chance to mate with this sorry fellow with this rather brutal tail, or this flashy guy with this amazing tail, well, you would probably choose to mate with this guy. And it's just because that's what female peacocks look for in a mate. They look for certain traits, and they're going to mate with those. And because those guys get to mate more often, in the next generation, we can see that the population will resemble these guys more so than these guys. Now we know that natural selection can cause changes in a population, and here is one classic example. This is the peppered moth, and there's basically two kinds of peppered moth. There's the black one, which you can see quite noticeably here, and the white one, which you can see is quite well hidden. Now before industrialization in Great Britain, most of the trees were sort of white colored because they were covered in lichens. And it's not hard to imagine that the white form of the peppered moth had an incredible advantage over the black form. So it's not surprising that before industrialization, by far, most peppered moths were white. However, after industrialization, when they started to build factories and they started to pollute the air, those trees became a blacker color. Now, who has the advantage, right? These white peppered moths, who used to have an advantage, are now very conspicuous to a potential predator, whereas these black guys are now, that's the advantageous trait. These are the guys that are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits to the offspring. Finally, mutations. Now, the thing about mutations is they're random and unpredictable, and you can't control them in any way. What mutations can do is they can actually introduce new alleles and possibly new traits into a gene pool, therefore affecting the frequencies of the other traits. So if we take a look at a population here, and scattered in there we've got a dark blue form, a light blue form, and a green form. And you can see by the pie chart that it's about 1/3 of each. Now suddenly, all of a sudden, we have a mutation. We have this new form arising. And again, completely random sometimes when these things happen. But we have a couple of these new individuals popping up. And just the presence of these new individuals causes a slight decrease in the frequencies of the other forms of the population. So, quite simply put, mutations can cause variation in a gene pool, adding new traits.